afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this important discussion, Racing Toward a Vaccine. I'm Megan Hunter. I'm the President and CEO of the Morris County Chamber of Commerce and the Morris County Economic Development Corporation. On behalf of our members, our board, the panelists today, thank you for being with us. We continue to fulfill our mission here at the Morris County Chamber of Commerce to connect, to convene, to advocate, to collaborate, and to educate, now virtually. So thank you for joining us on this Zoom presentation today as we continue our mission, and our mission is your success. The Chamber and the Morris County region is fortunate to have extraordinary companies and members that are contributing in extraordinary ways to our quality of life, who are innovating every day and positively affecting the lives of millions across the globe. So thank you to our panelists for being with us today. And I now turn it over to our moderator, Dean Paranikis of the Healthcare Institute of New Jersey, to conduct the introductions. So thank you, Dean.
Megan, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted and honored to moderate such a distinguished panel on so timely and vital a topic. As we're all too painfully aware, we're in the midst of the worst global pandemic in over a century. The stunning speed and scope of the onset of COVID-19 and the ensuing tidal wave of events and information has made it difficult to keep up with developments on the health, societal, and economic fronts. Across this ever-changing landscape, the life sciences community has been working to combat COVID-19 through financial and product contributions and development of diagnostic tests, therapies, and vaccines. Information about Hinge member companies' efforts in these areas can be found on our website, www.hinge.org. To try and bring some coherence to what's happening on the ground, as challenging as that may be, the Chamber has assembled 3 experts with distinct perspectives about what New Jersey's research-based biopharmaceutical and medical technology companies are doing to combat COVID. Their complete bios are in the program materials, but by way of brief introduction, they are John Patrick Oroho, Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer for Porzio Life Sciences and a Principal of Porzio Bromberg and Newman. John will offer the perspective of a highly experienced practitioner and counselor to the life sciences sector who advises and assists our companies in navigating the complex and dense regulatory and compliance pathways to commercializing and disseminating their products. John is joined by Ed Harnaga, Vice President of R&D Corporate Affairs at Pfizer, Inc., which is, I'm pleased to note, a Hinge member company. As we all know, Pfizer is one of the major players in efforts to develop a COVID vaccine, and Ed will share observations about the challenges associated with that effort, which is currently in phase 3 clinical trials. They're joined by Dr. Pedro Rodriguez, National Manager of Medical Scientific Affairs at Roche Diagnostics Corporation, also a Hinge member company. Roche Diagnostics is a major and early maker of molecular diagnostic COVID tests that are a key component of our testing arsenal. Pedro will discuss Roche's efforts to develop and implement its COVID tests. So let me take a moment to explain the program format today. So we'll start with some brief opening comments from our panelists, followed by a series of questions that I will be posing to our panelists. We're leaving time for audience Q&A, and so I think you can, I believe the process is to post your questions on the system here, and then we'll select them from there. We'll conclude with some closing comments from the panelists and throw it back to Colette and Kay to close things out. So with that, let's get started. And so John Oroho, the floor is yours. Welcome. John, you're muted.
Thank you, Dean. I appreciate it. And yeah, no matter how many times you do these Zoom webinars, you always have to remember to unmute yourself. So, but yeah, this is a very interesting time. As Dean said, I'm a partner in the law firm Porzio Bromberg and Newman, and the Executive Vice President, Chief Strategy Officer of our wholly owned subsidiary, Porzio Life Sciences. And we assist companies in, getting ready to commercialize their products sell and market their products and distribute their products. And it's an area that the law firm has been involved in since the early 1970s. And we built out our subsidiary back in 2004. And since that, we've assisted in excess of 500 companies throughout the United States and around the world in connection with development of products. You know, how do you market and sell them? How do you market and sell them in a compliant fashion? And that's something we're going to talk about today. Is, you know, how do you do it this fast and get products approved and distributed to, you know, 330 million Americans as well as people around the globe in as short a time as the government has set. So with that, I look forward to the discussion today.
John, thank you. We'll next turn to Ed Harniga. Ed, welcome.
Great, thanks, Dean. Good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Great, terrific. Well, as Dean mentioned, I'm Ed Harniga. I lead corporate affairs for Pfizer's R&D organization. And while I'm not a scientist or a clinician, I have the pleasure and honor of working with thousands of them every day who are working tirelessly in this effort to address COVID-19. Just a few words about Pfizer's approach overall. You know, we've taken a sort of no stone unturned approach in how we're looking at developing solutions to address the COVID pandemic. We know we need therapies for patients who are ill, and we're working extensively on an antiviral that just entered the clinic. But the only way to really end this pandemic, to kind of help us return to a sense of normalcy, is going to be through a vaccine. You know, I'm proud to say that the vaccine that we have in development, we entered the clinic in May of this year in phase 1/2 trials. Those have progressed in July to phase 3 trials. We're currently at about 35,000 patients enrolled, many of which have already received their second dose in a 2-dose regimen that we're working through. And while we are working at great speed, I think the important thing to realize is that we're not compromising anything related to safety, quality, efficacy in the efforts that we're taking. We're doing a lot of work to invest at risk, to take steps that used to happen sequentially and remove the white space in between them, to have things happen in a parallel format with a really keen focus on the safety. I'm looking forward to discussing a little bit more about the program with you. I'll just say one thing, you know, at Pfizer, we have this saying that we sort of launched around the time of COVID, and that is that science will win. It's something that our scientists truly believe. Whether it's science coming out of our labs or labs of our competitors or academics around the country, we truly believe that solutions are on the horizon, and we're hopeful towards that. So just keep in mind, science will win.
Ed, thank you. And now let's welcome Dr. Pedro Rodriguez. Good afternoon, Pedro.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Dean, for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers for having us as part of this panel. It's such a great opportunity to convey the importance of diagnostics in this calculation as well. Much like Ed had alluded to, you know, we at Roche, we've taken the similar approach of not leaving any stone unturned. It's Roche Diagnostics as a whole, just to give you a brief intro, is a manufacturer of tests across a wide range of not only disease areas, you know, infectious disease, genomics, oncology, women's health, etc., but also utilizing various technologies. And so one of the ones I'm here to talk the most about today is about PCR. So this is our molecular business, but we also serve in antibody and antigen detection, tissue histology, as well as sequencing. Our SARS-CoV-2 response has been multi-pronged thus far in the last 6 or 7 months. We've had very strong focus in the molecular aspect of testing, as well as in serology. So this is our anti-SARS-CoV-2 antibody, as well as in markers for the cytokine storm. So there's an EUA for interleukin-6 as well. And then recently we've had a success in an EUA for point of care testing using a LIAT, little toaster size instrument, which can produce a nucleic acid test result in under 20 minutes for SARS-CoV-2, as well as flu A and flu B. I'm happy to say that right there in New Jersey, not too far away from Morris County, just south on 287 for the locals, is the global manufacturer in Branchburg. And that site itself is responsible for providing about 30% of the world's testing for SARS-CoV-2 PCR testing. So that's a proud statement, and it's on overdrive, and we hope to boost that with building up our manufacturing capabilities shortly.
Well, thank you. And of course, hearing from such distinguished companies as Pfizer and Roche reinforces the reputation we well earned as the medicine chest of the world. So let's turn now to questions from our panelists. And the first one I'm going to direct to John. And John, your introductory comments are a perfect segue to the my first question, which I'll direct to you. And of course, after John answers, if either of our or both of our other panelists wish to add anything, by all means, feel free to do so. That'll be our format, more of a discussion. So John, we've heard a lot about what is known as Operation Warp Speed. If you could give a brief summary of what that actually is for those who may not have been as familiar with it, and how does it differ from the standard vaccine development process, and what are the difficulties in staying compliant while also expediting these processes?
Yeah, thanks, Dean. Operation Warp Speed is really a joint program between HHS, Health and Human Services, and all of the sub-agencies such as NIH, CDC, FDA, that come under the supervision of Health and Human Services and Secretary Alex Azar. So Operation Warp Speed is a joint operation between HHS and the Department of Defense. And really the reason for that is the Department of Defense is much more equipped to handle wide-scale distribution, wide-scale manufacturing. Think about, getting ready for a major battle or going to, war overseas. They have the logistic capabilities that many private companies, do not have and would dream to have. So by putting those two cabinet agencies together, Operation Warp Speed looked to, significantly decrease the time to get a product from invention to market to distribution. And if you look at it, the typical time to get a product from invention to distribution is about 12 years. And if you look really, the average for clinical trials is 6 to 7 years. And as Ed said earlier, Pfizer's gone from, invention in May to clinical trials in July. And the likelihood is that the various vaccine candidates are going to be available for distribution November, December, first quarter, depending on, how the phase 3 clinical trials go. But at the same time, they've also increased the manufacturing. And what they've done is they've removed the risk. Because typically, if you're doing clinical trials, you do them sequentially, as Ed had said. And if phase 1 is successful, phase 2 is successful, then you go to the large scale phase 3, which is very expensive, very time consuming. And you won't even start to manufacture until you get some really good feeling that the product's going to get approved. And then you have to figure out how to handle the distribution aspect of it. And DOD and HHS have partnered with McKesson in connection with that. So that just shows you the overall speed of Operation Warp Speed, where you've gone from really invention in the spring to possible distribution by the end of the year, and if not then, by early first quarter, 2021.
Breathtaking. Any additional thoughts that either of you other gentlemen might wish to add to that in terms of your experiences? Well, it's interesting because Pedro, you used the acronym EUA, and a few months ago, nobody would have known what an EUA was, which is, of course, Emergency Use Authorization. And it's remarkable how much we've all had to learn in so tight a period of time. Yep. So turning to Ed, as you mentioned, Pfizer is currently involved, along with its partner Bioiontech SE, in requests to expand the enrollment of your phase 3 vaccine trial to up to approximately 44,000 participants. So how does Pfizer and BioNTech measure the efficacy of vaccine trials such as this one?
Thanks, Dean. That's a great question. Well, there's a few different ways that we're looking at measuring efficacy. If we look at the earlier stages of the trial, the phase 1, 2, and the readouts that we had there, what we were looking at initially is to look at antibody levels, right? That is the response that the body's immune system is having to the vaccine. And we're able to evaluate sort of, you know, where are we pegged next to, say, human convalescent serum, plasma from patients that have recovered from the disease. So kind of comparing levels of antibodies in vaccinated patients to those patients that have recovered. That's one way to start looking at it and to start seeing, are we seeing the immune response that we think may allow for levels of protection. The other thing that we're looking at is we're looking at T cells, the memory cells that the immune system has, to see are we measuring levels in those cells as well that are on the rise from the vaccine itself. But ultimately, we need to prove that the vaccine can prevent infection. So the primary endpoint that we're looking at is a comparison to cases that develop in the placebo group. You have to remember that in this trial of 44,000 patients, when we get up to that level, well, we're at 35,000 now. So you think about 32,500, or sorry, what do we have about, you know, half of that population has had the placebo, half of that population has gotten the vaccine. What we're tracking then is to see when do we hit a certain level of cases of COVID infection. The trial is blinded to Pfizer and to the participants in the trial. What we'll see is there's a data monitoring committee, a third-party review committee that's looking at the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. When we reach a certain threshold that's been established in the protocol for the trial for cases, they will unblind that data, and they'll be able to look at the comparison between infection rates in the placebo group versus infection rates in the control group. FDA has stated that they want to see about a 50% efficacy, meaning that it has to prevent 50% of the infections in that vaccinated group. Our trial design, the protocol was designed for a threshold of 60%, so really aiming for higher than that. But ultimately, we're hoping for a much higher threshold of prevention above the 50% threshold. So when the data monitoring committee unblinds it, they'll look at those numbers. If they see a reason to halt the trial because of the fact that we've seen a significant efficacy, they'll do that. But halting the trial doesn't mean we stop the trial. Halting the trial means there's data that we can submit and focus on, is there an FDA submission that can come from that? The trial will continue to run, and we'll continue to gather data on these participants for about 2 years. And we're really trying to look at the long-term effects of the vaccine, both in an efficacy, is it continuing to protect people over time, but most importantly, from a safety perspective, to make sure that we have that safety database to see how the vaccine is performing over time as well.
Well, we certainly look forward to these developments as they move forward, and Lord knows it's critically important work. Yes.
I'd love to make a comment on that too, because I found that fascinating. You know, one thing that we always talk about internally on the testing side is for the vaccinated population, or even as folks achieve their own sort of natural immunity, what's important in parallel may be to have a test that could pretty much predict or in a sense diagnose if there's an immune component, right? So if a person's been vaccinated, can you detect with using these antibody assays that they are in fact immune? So looking at this sort of holy grail concept of high avidity, high affinity antibodies to help determine that. So my bigger point is, you know, we're starting to partner with vaccine manufacturers as well, and implementing our test into their trial designs, because this is the perfect opportunity to see the efficacy on the testing side as well, and using that sort of co-development partnership, hopefully we can get some interesting antibody assays out there to predict just that as well.
That's great.
Good to hear. Obviously, one of the things we've seen, of course, over the last 6 months is unprecedented collaborations across the industry, among pharma companies and between pharma companies and diagnostic companies, and it's producing some remarkable results. And obviously, it couldn't come at a better time. So Pedro, you oversee a team that is on the front lines helping with, among other things, education and helping labs improve implement their testing. What improvements have you and your team seen in the efficacy and timeliness of testing in the course of this undertaking?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I think efficacy in the testing world, that's sort of equivalent to accuracy or sensitivity of testing, specificity, performance. In terms of performance, we've seen really from the beginning, some of the manufacturers of what we call high throughput testing, which utilizes pretty large robotics with high throughput that go down to the extremely low level of molecular detection. So these are PCR or similar type of nucleic acid detection assays. Those are very sensitive, bar none. That performance is pretty rock solid. Where it gets a little bit less so on the sensitivity side is when you start moving your assays over to kind of a paper format, what we call lateral flow. So these are what we think of as some of the rapid antibodies out there. And they do sacrifice a bit of sensitivity, but I want to caution that may be okay. Depending on the patient, you need to test. If someone already has clinical risk factors determined by their clinician to be a high risk candidate or patient potentially having COVID, then a lower sensitivity threshold may not be such a terrible thing because they're probably just going to have so much of the nucleic acid material or the immune material to test from in that lateral flow design. So that's a bit about performance. In terms of timeliness, I'm glad you asked that question because this is something we hear about quite a bit, getting these test results back on time. Yeah. Rapid assays can get them back between 5 to 20 minutes, and those are great for the right patient and if you have access to them. The big cause of the bottleneck for timeliness of testing that we've been hearing about, upwards of 3 to 5 to 7 days, or maybe even worse from one case to another, tends to be the backlog of specimens that are waiting to be tested. And so most, if not all manufacturers, EUAs, have an intended use for symptomatic patient testing. And what we see out there are a lot of testing being done in asymptomatic, sort of broad type screening programs, if you will. And all of that adds to the backlog to try to push through these robotic instrumentation. And therefore you do have a delay there. Of course, there are other factors that contribute to delays like transportation time and things like that. But most of these manufactured robotic large throughput assays take between 3 to 4 to 5 hours on average to pump out results at hundreds at a time. So that's less the problem, and it's more so everything that happens just before it gets to the lab and how long these samples are waiting in the queue to get tested, depending on the demand that you do see.
Well, certainly, again, I mean, the testing aspect of it continues to be very topical. In fact, just yesterday, of course, there was a major announcement about the availability of new diagnostic tests. So clearly, it's a critical part of the solution. In addition, we've been partnered with in conjunction with the vaccine. John, what implications do you foresee COVID-19 and the multiple vaccine trials having on compliance in the future?
Well, I think one of the things we have to look at in conjunction with this is that not only are there clinical trials going on vaccines, but we also have investment in therapeutic treatments. And, you've heard a lot, Dean, you said earlier, 6 months ago, who knew what an EUA was, emergency use authorization. But, that's basically where, the FDA is saying, we've seen enough evidence that this product is safe and effective, and therefore, even though the large-scale trials aren't done, we're going to go ahead and allow it for this particular use. Look, for many, many years, there's been a lot of enforcement around what's called off-label marketing, and the concern I have in the compliance arena is that doctors can prescribe drugs for whatever they think it will help. And many, many drugs are the standard of care for, therapeutic areas that has not even yet been approved by the FDA, especially in oncology and other places like that. So my concern is that, for a compliance standpoint, there's going to be a tendency for, not the major companies that we're talking, with today, but there are a lot of, other companies, emerging companies pop up every day, and, they can license, a product, and it might be approved for one thing, but they go out there and they can market it for, a different therapeutic area. And I think that's my biggest concern in conjunction with the rapidity and how fast everything is going here, is that you'll tend to see, some commercial people, both in the marketing and the distribution, try to, kind of basically, make out in connection with the emergency. And I think you've got to be more concerned in the therapeutic treatment area, in connection with that. And like I said, there's been many, many cases around off-label use, but recently there's been some court decisions a few years ago, which basically said that the First Amendment there has protections for commercial free speech. So that has dampened the enforcement around off-label marketing cases. And as a result, we have to be more focused in on, what type of representations are being made so that improper products aren't used for the wrong things.
Just as a follow-on to that, John, a corollary to that is the speed to outcome that's happened with this acceleration you mentioned, the dramatic acceleration. How do you, at this point, is it too early to say what that timeline or that continuum will look like going forward? Let's assume once we can gain our control over this particular pandemic in terms of the process itself.
Well, I think the real thing there is whether or not you remove the financial risk. If you remove the financial risk, you can increase the speed. If I'm developing a product, and maybe I have a grant from NIH, but the fact of the matter is I'm taking a major financial risk. And here we have a situation where you have clinical trials going on, at the same time manufacturing is going on, at the same time distribution is starting up. There's not a lot of venture capitalists, private equity firms, or publicly traded companies that are going to be willing to take that risk unless the government is backstopping it. So I think that's what I see as that will probably prohibit, this type of acceleration, except in other situations like this in the future.
Ed, recently 9 biopharmaceutical CEOs, including Pfizer's CEO, signed a pledge to continue to make the safety and well-being of vaccinated individuals the top priority in development of the first COVID vaccines. What steps is Pfizer taking alongside the 8 other companies in guaranteeing this safety and well-being for vaccinated individuals in light of the recently expanded phase 3 vaccine trial?
Sure, it's a great question. And the pledge, I think, was a very historic moment. I've never seen companies come together like this. And it was brought about for a simple reason. I mean, we know that the vaccine is only going to be useful if people trust in the development process and the standards and scientific rigor that went into creating that vaccine. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of surveys that are showing people wouldn't feel comfortable taking the vaccine when it's approved. And this was an opportunity for these companies to come together and really put a stake in the ground and say, look, we are following the highest standards we can have, standards that have been used to develop vaccines for decades. We're following FDA guidelines. We are really going to follow every step along the way. And we know emergency use authorization at the FDA may be releasing new guidelines that their external advisory committee will then be reviewing. But we know that we need the results from a well-powered phase 3 safety and efficacy trial before submitting. And that's what that pledge said, is that we're committing to following the process through and seeing where it takes us. Now, from a safety perspective, some of the things that we're doing from a Pfizer perspective that I can speak to directly, The earlier stages of the vaccine, we've seen that the vaccine seems to be well tolerated. The most common adverse events were mild to moderate. They were fever, chills, injection site pain, things that you typically see with a vaccine. But we have a data safety monitoring committee, which is a third-party group, which is reviewing the data from the trial on a regular basis. They see all of the data that comes in. They see any adverse events that come up, and they can stop the trial at any point in time if they feel there's a safety signal or a concern that we need to address. Thankfully, they haven't stopped the trial. It's still enrolling. We're up to 35,000. You mentioned the 44,000. And I think that's an important piece too. We were surprised at how quickly the trial enrolled. We were pleasantly surprised to see so many people coming out and engaging in this clinical trial. And because we were able to enroll so quickly, we thought, let's expand the trial to 44,000, which provides an even larger safety database in the long run. So that'll give us opportunity to really monitor and see how this vaccine is performing in more patients over time. So I'd say those are the sort of things that we're doing to really make sure, but they follow all the standards that we've had out there for decades in the way that we've been developing vaccines.
Thank you. Pedro, in one interview, you're quoted as saying Roche's tagline is, and I quote, "Doing now what patients need next, but we should consider modifying this because we're doing now what patients need now," unquote. What is your team doing now that patients need now, and what have been the biggest hurdles for your team in implementing them?
Yeah, well, I think, this conversation is kind of spot on, hearing from Ed's experience too. I think he would agree on the Pfizer experience. We're all just, every day living the needs of the population and how our respective companies can address that and collaborate and work to kind of further the advance of knowledge and treatment and testing. What we, and I think John said it really nicely up front, the typical timeline is a little different in the diagnostic side between, market assessment for the needs of a test and actually research and development and submitting to the FDA. It's much shorter. It's on the order of 3 to 5 years. But again, we have put together testing, and I think we researched and developed our SARS-CoV-2 initial test in a matter of 3 weeks and had that submitted to the FDA for EUA filing. So the timeline's extremely condensed. So by de facto, we're doing now what is needed immediately. But we're also implementing claims as we go to expand the use of this test in real time. So to give you a concrete example, early on, we put out the test and we had claims for 2 different types of collection media that could be used. So the swab that is collected from the nasopharyngeal part of the nose is dipped into a liquid that has a media that stabilizes the virus, right? And that gets capped off, it gets sent to the lab. Clearly, early on, we started to see some bottlenecks in having access to swabs, in having access to these types of tubes and different medias. So this is outside of many of our control. These are third-party suppliers. And we had to quickly expand the claims to include more media types, more swab types that can be put onto the test. Another example is that labs, again, this backlog, which is real in hundreds, if not thousands of patients waiting to get tested. One solution to that is to potentially pool, that is to put patient samples together into one tube and load that onto the instrument. And you could basically increase your throughput by a factor of 4 or 5 times if you're willing and if the lab knows how to weigh the advantages as well as careful disadvantages of doing that, right? You can sacrifice performance in doing that. So you have to have a very careful validation, someone who knows what they're doing and can monitor that. And the FDA has given some clear guidance around it. So to that end, we put out a pooling, or we're submitting for a pooling claim, which hopefully will be with us any day or week now, that is going to aid in labs increasing their throughput if they want to undertake pooling as a form of testing. So it's just this kind of fast timeline of what's needed and implementing and expanding claims, but also, medical affairs, which is the office I work in, and it's no different in any of my colleagues' medical offices. we can help laboratories in our case, or in their case, maybe medical physicians on the front lines to understand the ramifications of using a test, whether it be in a modified or off-label way, or just understanding the broader clinical trial data to support a test's EUA. And we've been supporting many labs who want to validate their test for additional swab types, for example, or additional media types, which they're authorized to do, and they have to submit this data to the FDA and notify the FDA as soon as they're testing patients in this way. So a few different examples of how we've been doing now what patients need kind of as the moment comes up, which is so extremely different from our pre-COVID day-to-day.
I don't know if I caught you, but did you describe what pooling is?
Yeah, pooling is basically when you take a few patient specimens and put them together into one essentially test tube that gets loaded onto the instrument that is going to test them. If you do that, you can sacrifice sensitivity, right? If you're not careful, for some patients who have low viral titers. So every laboratory director, the leaders of the labs, have to do their very careful patient analysis of their population and a careful validation to ensure that the risk of that is extremely low. So that falls on their shoulders to do that validation. But that's what pooling is. It could, in theory, multiply on the order of 3 to 4 to 5 times your throughput going through that robotic instrument.
So let's turn now to distribution, John. In connection with the wide scale distribution of the vaccines when they start becoming available, what do you see as the byplay in terms of coordination between the federal and state governments to secure distribution at that point in time when we reach that point? I know there's been discussions about prioritizing who would receive the vaccines and the like, but obviously the threshold question is, how does it get out into wherever it's intended to go?
Yeah, this is an area that people get confused about, because they think, well, the federal government can just say, distribute the product and it goes out, without any other government being involved. But that's not how the distribution model works in the United States. Matter of fact, distribution standards are set by the federal government, most notably in what's referred to as the PDMA, the Prescription Drug Marketing Act, which was actually signed during the end of the Reagan presidency, all the way up to the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which was signed during the end of President Obama's administration. And what those set is federal standards that distributors have to meet and that states have to enforce. But those are the minimum standards. The states can enforce higher requirements. And in actuality, if you're going to distribute a drug here in New Jersey, you don't get a license from the federal government to distribute drugs here in New Jersey. You get it from the state of New Jersey. And same thing with California, New York, Texas. And so there has to be this coordination between federal and state. And as I said earlier, McKesson received a major contract to be the lead distributor in connection with this. And their contract is definitely is directly with HHS and the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is going to oversee that part. But McKesson has to make sure when they receive that product, they're receiving it from a licensed facility. Because if they haven't received it from a licensed facility, according to the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, according to various state pedigree laws, they can't distribute it then to the end users. If the end user, the various sites where these vaccines are going to be given, whether it's a chain store drugstore, whether it's urgent care clinics, whether it is, hospital sites and the like, they have to make sure that that facility, McKesson and the other distributors in the chain, have to make sure that facility is properly licensed, or they can't send it there. So it becomes a game of hot potato. You know, if you're McKesson and you receive the product from somebody who's unlicensed, you can't do anything with it. And if the person you're going to send it to, or the entity you're going to send it to, isn't properly licensed in that state, you can't distribute it to them. So you're left, you know, holding a lot of product. And the other aspect of this is some of these drugs have to be, you know, very closely monitored temperature-wise. Several of the vaccines are minus 112 degrees Fahrenheit. So they have to be handled through cold chain for supply chain purposes. So, you know, states will have, you know, very strict regulations and rules around the shipping, monitoring, and receiving of that product to make sure that eventually when it's administered to a patient, that it hasn't become contaminated along the way. And that's just focusing in on the vaccine part. There's also the part we talked about earlier about the therapeutic treatments, and you're going to have the same type of issues there as well.
Obviously, a complex regime between the multiple levels, and that's the beauties of our federated system.
Correct.
I have just 2 points to add to John's.
Sure, please.
I think just are important to mention, because you did mention sort of how do they determine who's going to get the vaccine too separately. And I think it's important for the participants to understand. I mean, the CDC has a group called ACIP. It's the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And they meet to really evaluate who should get this vaccine. They'll be putting together a priority list of people, probably starting with frontline healthcare workers, maybe the first, particularly if there is an emergency use authorization that's declared. ACIP would really guide the directions in terms of who gets the vaccine and when. The other piece that we have to look at is there will be limited distribution initially. I mean, from a Pfizer perspective, we've said we could supply up to about 100 million doses this year, but the vast majority of the doses will be provided in the next year. So for a group like ACIP to make those decisions to guide who should get it, at-risk individuals, I think are going to be very important to have out there, and the states will need to work within those guidelines as well. The only other piece I'll add that John mentioned, just because it's an important point, is the cold chain storage. You know, Pfizer's vaccine is one that needs to be stored at cold chain. I don't know the Fahrenheit connection, but it's minus 80 degrees Celsius is what we're looking at. We've developed for the distribution process these sort of unique shippers that are packed with dry ice and can keep the vaccine at stability temperatures for up to 10 days. And they're packed with a GPS device that monitors constant temperature of the container, as well as a GPS location of it. And then once those arrive at the sites, they can also be reloaded on a regular basis to get another 15 days of storage just in the unit. And then the vaccine can also be stored at regular temperatures, for refrigerator temperatures, for about 5 days. So there's a number of different methods that are being put in place, and we're continuing to do validation to make sure that the product will be stable at those levels for the periods of time that we're hoping to get it out there. But in a pandemic situation, you also have to remember people are going to be vaccinated relatively quickly, which is the hope, obviously.
But this all is also illustrative, though, of yet another dimension of the medical innovation that our companies engage in. It's not just the development of a vaccine or a test, but how do you manufacture it to scale, to quality, to volume? How do you get it out where it needs to be so that it's delivered the way it's intended to be? Yeah. But that's an interesting segue, Ed, to the fact that your vaccine is a new type, which I understand is called an mRNA vaccine. Yeah. Can you tell us how this vaccine differs from more traditional vaccines?
Sure, yeah. The mRNA, it's messenger RNA. It's a new vaccine technology that we started. You mentioned our German company, Bioiontech, our biotech partner, Biontech. We've actually
Sorry if I mispronounced it.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's fine. We've been working with them for about 2 years now to develop sort of a next generation flu vaccine. And so the work that went into working with them, collaborating with them, actually helped us lead to getting the mRNA vaccine for COVID into the clinic faster. Now, it's a new approach. It's never been used before. There aren't any approved vaccines on the market yet in this type. But traditional vaccines generally use a sort of weakened or deactivated virus to make the vaccine, right? With an mRNA vaccine, we don't actually need the virus. We just need the virus's genetic code. And then what we're able to do is take the messenger RNA from that code. We encapsulate it in sort of a lipid nanoparticle that allows our cells to uptake that and pull the mRNA in. And the mRNA, messenger RNA, it provides the instructions for our own cells to create the spike protein antigen. You know, if you look at the coronavirus, it has corona crown because it has all these spike proteins, and the spikes are what the virus uses to enter our cells and replicate. So the idea is that you get your own cells to just produce that antigen, not the virus itself, and hopefully get an antibody response that can neutralize that. And the hope there is that you're building a strong enough response that over time you'll have protection from the actual virus when it comes along. It's an exciting new technology. The point about it that I think is really critical and why we looked at it for flu is because it can be rapidly produced. If you think about the flu vaccine, every year the flu strains are released and then companies rush to create the flu vaccine. And then by the time we get the flu vaccine out, the circulating strains may have mutated. And now the strain isn't matching the vaccine. With mRNA technology, you can produce batches of the vaccine in a period of a few weeks versus months. So the idea that even if you had a change in the genetic structure of a particular virus or pathogen, you may be able to readjust and produce a vaccine quicker. So that's the hope of the technology. Again, it's a new technology. We're working with it. Moderna, which is another vaccine company that's in advanced trials, their vaccine is also an mRNA vaccine.
Well, we obviously hope for the best, and certainly with novel approaches like this, it's interesting. And I know one often thinks if you get a flu shot and then the bug kind of moves in another direction. So Pedro, how has Roche's previously developed diagnostics portfolio played a role in supporting patient management in hospitals during the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you know, Roche's portfolio consists of a variety of markers. I would say the ones that probably have played the largest role in hospitalized patients are probably the critical care markers. So we're thinking on the cardiac line, that would be markers of heart failure like troponin. On the sepsis or critical care line, that would be markers like interleukin-6, procalcitonin, sepsis markers, lactate, ferritin. There's a variety of things that fall into the blood work or the urinalysis type of technologies. Then there's kind of looking out a little bit. You know, we're entering what will be soon the real start of flu season and cold season generally. So we need to be able to rule out and rule in patients who actually have COVID versus flu, probably the two most severe, RSV being another one, and many other types of cold viruses, so to speak, out there that Roche does have testing available for, which labs are going to be relying on heavily to rule in or out this year when it gets really confusing with common symptoms that are shared between those. And we actually just received an EUA last week or 2 weeks ago now, the time's all a blur, for a combined SARS-CoV-2/Flu A, Flu B test to aim at doing just that. With one sample from the patient, you can get any of those markers and hopefully rule them in or out of one of those categories.
Remarkable. So we now have a couple of questions from our audience, if I can direct them. And Kay, help me out here if I don't do this right. But I hear, let's see, the first one we received is, who is on the Independent Data Monitoring Committee, and how can Americans be assured the committee is not under political pressure? So I throw the question out to any of the three of you who may be able to offer any insights on that question.
I'm happy to jump in, Dean. So the Independent Data Monitoring Committee is unique to each vaccine that's being developed. It's put together with a panel of experts that are leaders in the field of vaccines or leaders in medical practice. And they're really there to be an unbiased third party to evaluate the data that's coming in. I think the way that we assure that we can assure that it doesn't become politicized, we don't disclose the names of who sits on that panel prior to the submission to the FDA. So while they're doing their job, we hope that those names remain independent, that they remain anonymous for now so that they can do their work without any pressure or without even getting calls from media that may actually want to ask questions to them. Their focus should be just on reviewing the data, evaluating it, and making sure that the trial continues to move forward safely or stop if there is an issue. If I didn't mention this before, but at those interim analyses that we talk about, we are hoping that it leads to an effective vaccine, but it could very well lead to the fact that the vaccine is stopped for futility as well. And that's what that committee is there to do. So again, all of that information is submitted with the FDA submission, and it'll also be made public probably at the FDA's VRBPAC committee meeting as well.
Thank you. And certainly this is yet another example how our educational realm is just expanding exponentially as we're all trying to get our heads around this. Okay, the next question we have is...
Dean, on that...
yes,
on that
go ahead, John. Sure,
yeah,
of course.
On that last question, I think the other thing people have to remember too is that the manufacturers that are doing the clinical trials and that are going to market and distribute these products, all are very reputable companies. And let's face it, anybody who's ever been involved in class action product liability lawsuits realize that, the risks associated with, developing, manufacturing, and distributing drugs. So I think, and that goes to the issue earlier where the 9 CEOs came out and said, we're not going to put a vaccine out there. We're not going to put out therapeutic treatments until we are convinced that they are safe and effective. Because on the back end, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, they're the ones that'll have to defend product liability lawsuits, and the late night commercials of, if you've been impacted by this, call our office, 1-800, et cetera. So that's the other aspect that I think people have to realize and take heart, that, the companies that the government has funded, they're not going to put their reputations and their financials, position at risk, and their shareholders at risk by putting a product out there that's not safe and effective.
Point well taken. We do have another question from our audience, and it doubles back on the issue of who would first receive the vaccine. And the question is, please comment on Zeke Emanuel's thinking that vaccinating front workers, I guess that means frontline workers, first may not be the best vaccine strategy. Any takers on that one? Okay.
I'll just say, because I was the one who mentioned it, that ACIP, obviously ACIP is going to decide the structure and what ACIP is. It's an advisory panel with experts in vaccines and public health. They'll be evaluating all the different, options for vaccinating, and I think they'll come forward with a decision. I'm not a public health expert or an epidemiologist, so it's really up for them to really make those decisions, and they do listen to testimony of other parties when they're making those decisions. So it's an opportunity for Zeke Emanuel to speak to them and share his opinions before they make a decision.
Well, obviously, I think the one thing that you're all pointing out is the complexity of this total process is just mind-boggling, and the degree of expertise and the types of expertise that are required. So we're now, as we are approaching the close of our hour, I'm going to invite our panelists to offer some closing comments. So why don't we take it in inverse order this time, and we'll start with Pedro and conclude with John.
All right. Well, thank you, Dean. And I just want to extend, deep appreciation to the fellow panelists representing different walks of life and different companies who are, pushing, among other manufacturers out there and entities, to try to bring forth testing and therapeutics at lightning speed for the betterment of society as we get through this pandemic. But first and foremost, also thanking those of you in the audience today who are healthcare professionals and fighting truly in the front lines with these patients. My hat goes off to you. I want to say that from the diagnostics perspective, I'm glad I had a chance to speak to that a little bit today. And it is we feel just in the common everyday living room in America now, you're talking about testing and diagnostics, and it frankly didn't quite seem like that before COVID. So it's an important conversation. This is how decisions can be made and are made most times by healthcare professionals to enable them to, manage the patient accordingly or provide a specific therapeutic. And we will continue pushing to try to make sure we address the needs of the patients out there during COVID and other disease areas as well. So thanks everyone. Appreciate the time, and speak soon, hopefully.
Pedro, thank you. Ed, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Dean, and Pedro, John. It's been great serving on this panel with you. I've been very inspired over the past few months to see the outreach and the way that companies have come together and the industry has come together, academics, government, companies, to really solve this pandemic, whether it's Roche working on diagnostics, Gilead moving forward antivirals, the many companies that are working to bring vaccines to market. It's not just about, it's a very different time frame if you think about competition among companies. Years ago, it was about who could get the vaccine to market first, who could get a vaccine out there. Right now, we need multiple vaccines. We need more than one company to succeed. We are wishing our competitors as much luck in their development as we're hoping for in our development. I've seen this sort of collaboration happening through different groups, whether it's the NIH Active Coalition, which is bringing together companies to work and share best practices, the companies that have released their protocols for their vaccines. These are unheard of levels of transparency that are happening in the industry. Our hope is that over time, people will recognize, the value of what the industry does bring to society. And our hope is that we will have solutions to this pandemic that can return us to normal life soon. So I'll just end on my last comment of science will win, and that's my hope.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
John, bring us home.
Thanks, Dean, and I'd like to also thank Ed and Pedro for a really interesting discussion, and thank Megan Hunter from the Morris County Chamber of Commerce and everybody else from the Chamber who put this together. The one thing I do like to leave people with is, there have been concerns of, people saying, would I take the vaccine? Would I give the vaccine to my children? That kind of stuff. Would I take, drugs for, therapeutic treatments, etc. I think the thing is to understand that these companies have built tremendous compliance programs, which, really, the compliance programs, I was speaking at the Pharmaceutical Compliance Congress about a month ago, and they've built these programs where compliance is built right into all aspects of their business. And they're, basically the programs are designed in such a way so that they can operationalize their business to be in compliance with a multitude of laws and regulations across all 50 states, the federal government, and obviously, other countries around the world. And these compliance departments that are embedded throughout the operating units and R&D units and stuff are really the conscience behind, these companies. And it's something that's really kind of evolved over the last 20 years. It used to be, legal would get involved after something happened. And now compliance, which is made up of professionals from legal, finance, R&D, commercial activities, they put these programs together so that they can train all their employees, so that there's universal policies that everybody adheres to. So, that's where they stake their reputation because they have these well-evolved compliance programs. And that gives me confidence that the drugs that are developed, that the vaccines are developed will be safe and effective, and that I would have no problem in giving to my children or taking myself or my wife, whatever.
Well, certainly it is the work of organizations and companies and individuals such as yourselves that give us all a great deal of optimism and confidence that, to use Ed's phrase, science will win. And we look forward eagerly to that. We wish everyone well in their efforts. I want to thank you again for the privilege of having moderated so distinguished and informed a panel. I think it's been a great experience for everyone involved. And with that, I thank you for your time, and I'll turn it over to you.